No one ever told you this because you weren't supposed to hear it, because the moment you know it, you can't unknow it. And from that moment forward, the world no longer feels safe or fair or innocent. In the autumn silence of 1830's Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, behind whitewashed barns and endless rows of corn, a secret was born. A secret that would cost men their fortunes, their names, and their lives, not because of some faceless warlord or distant tyrant, but because of 4 women, sisters, daughters of a dead man's will and a system built to erase them. And if you think this story is only about history, you are wrong. This is about control, about what happens when laws are written not for justice but for power, about how the human mind, once cornered, becomes more dangerous than any weapon. The Brennan sisters. Bridget, Catherine, Margaret, Sarah. To their neighbors, they were dutiful Irish Catholic girls, pale, devout, bound to the land their father bled for. But inside the walls of their farmhouse, their faces lit only by a single candle, they swore an oath that would echo like a curse across Lancaster for generations. It began with loss. Patrick Brennan, their father, had built an empire from dirt. 850 acres of prime Pennsylvania soil, barns that dwarfed neighbors' houses, silos that fed half the county in winter. But Patrick made one fatal mistake. He died without a son, and in the eyes of the law, daughters were nothing. His kingdom was to be divided, sold, and broken apart. The world was ready to scatter them like chaff in the wind, married off, renamed, absorbed into other men's households, erased. But that night, as the November frost crept across the window glass, the sisters decided the world would not have its way. They sat together in silence, listening to the fire hiss, until Bridget, the eldest, spoke. Her voice did not tremble. It did not beg. It commanded, "We stay together, whatever it takes." Those 4 words were the match that lit a fire so dark, its smoke still chokes the archives of Lancaster's courthouses. Because their decision was not survival, it was war. Understand this. Every age has its forbidden truths, the things whispered in the dark but never said aloud, and one of those truths is this: when the powerless are denied every path to security, they will create their own. With charm, with deception, with blood. The Brennan sisters looked at the law, the church, the community, and they saw chains. They saw rules designed to strip them of everything their father had built. And they understood something most men never dare to face. Rules are not divine. They are tools, and tools can be broken. So they began to plan, not like grieving daughters, but like generals sketching battle lines. Bridget, with her mind like a blade, mapped the finances and the inheritance statutes. Catherine, with eyes that pierced through men's souls, studied weaknesses. Margaret, whose beauty was as disarming as poison disguised as perfume, prepared the bait. And Sarah, the youngest, wore the masks, innocent maiden, devout parishioner, weeping lamb. A conspiracy was forming, so quiet, so intimate, that not even the walls of their stone farmhouse could betray it. Their first target was not random. It was chosen with precision. Thomas Hennessy, the county's most powerful attorney, wealthy, influential, a widower. He was the man who could reshape the very laws that sought to dismantle their farm. And within weeks of meeting Bridget, he was theirs. Or so he thought. Understand the brilliance here. They didn't just marry him for security. They made him rewrite the architecture of inheritance itself, securing the farm in ironclad trusts, rerouting assets, bending the very system that had threatened them. And then, once his usefulness had run its course, his death came like fog off the river, thick, suffocating, and seemingly natural. A fall from his horse, they said. An accident. But tell me, how does an expert rider, who had traveled that road 1,000 times, break his neck on a calm March morning? How does his horse return to the farmhouse wild-eyed and frothing, as though it had galloped through hell itself? And why? Why did Bridget weep in public, yet move with ruthless efficiency in private, securing every deed, every coin, every line of inheritance within days of the funeral? No jury ever asked, no neighbor dared accuse, because everyone prefers the comfort of an accident to the terror of a conspiracy. But Lancaster remembered, quietly, in shadows, the laughter of the sisters after the funeral, the way they moved like a single organism through the farmhouse halls, The way they looked at the world not as women seeking husbands, but as predators hunting prey. And here is where you must lean closer, because the descent has only begun. Nessie was just the first sacrifice. The machine was in motion. One by one, powerful men would walk into their orbit, bankers, judges, landowners, and one by one they would fall, some into love, some into graves, but all into the iron grip of the Lancaster Sisters. You were never meant to know this. It was sealed away, buried under polite histories and sanitized obituaries. But the truth lingers, and as you hear it now, understand. This is not just a tale of 4 women. It is the anatomy of power, the anatomy of control. And if you keep listening, you will see the pattern, the same pattern that repeats in governments, corporations, and institutions today. The same strategy, only dressed in modern clothes. The Lancaster sisters may be gone, but the system they exposed, the hunger, the manipulation, the willingness to kill for legacy, that system never died. So I'll ask you this right now. If you had been there, in that farmhouse, staring into the flicker of that candlelight, watching 4 women swear an oath against the world itself, would you have seen them as victims or as monsters? The truth is more dangerous than either answer. The morning after Thomas Hennessy's funeral, Lancaster awoke to silence. But it wasn't the silence of mourning. It was the silence of suspicion, the kind that creeps into a man's bones when something doesn't fit. The town spoke politely of accident and tragedy, but behind closed doors, the whispers began. Personas with eerie ease, the devoted mourner, the flirtatious ingenue, the devout church singer. Bridget, though still veiled in black, directed it all. She was no longer just a widow, she was the architect, the general. If you watched them closely, you would see it, the subtle glances exchanged between sisters across a dinner table, the sudden silences when outsiders entered the room, the invisible current of loyalty stronger than blood. Crawford never stood a chance. His wealth was immense, his bank controlling mortgages across the county. He believed himself cautious, pragmatic, immune to folly. Yet Catherine unraveled him like a thread pulled from a garment. She spoke to him not of herself, but of family. She painted him as the savior of her sisters, the guardian of their father's sacred land. She made him believe he was stepping into something holy, not into the maw of a conspiracy. And Lancaster began to notice the pattern. 2 sisters, 2 wealthy widowers, both men tied to the Brennan farm, both taken into the family's circle, one already dead, another ensnared. But still, the county refused to name what it saw, because to name it would be to admit something terrifying, that 4 women, bound not by husbands but by blood, had learned to bend the laws of inheritance, the laws of society, the laws of survival itself, into a weapon. Do you see it now? Do you see the shape forming beneath the surface? This was not chance. This was design. The Lancaster sisters were not merely reacting to the world, they were remaking it. And here is where we confront the darker truth. Men underestimate. Again and again, across history, men believe they are the architects, the rulers, the authors of law and legacy. And yet, in the shadows, those denied power find ways to seize it, not with swords, but with silence, not with armies, but with oaths. The Brennans understood something primal. Power is not in the law. Power is in the hand that can bend the law to its will. Crawford was their next instrument. But instruments break. Instruments wear down. And when they do, they are discarded. Even the servants whispered it now. They claimed Bridget's laugh had changed after her marriage, lower, darker. No longer the laugh of a young bride, but of a commander whose plan was working. They claimed the sisters' eyes had taken on a strange light, as though they shared something unspoken, something ordinary people couldn't understand, and the fog of suspicion thickened. Neighbors remembered Hennessy's sudden death and wondered if Crawford would suffer the same fate. Some crossed themselves when they passed the farmhouse. Others muttered about curses and Irish superstitions, but no one dared confront the sisters directly. To accuse them was to risk their wrath, and by now the county understood wrath disguised as grace is the most lethal of all. Now, pause with me here. Think carefully. This is where you must look beyond the surface of the story. This is not just the tale of 4 sisters. It is a mirror. It reflects something about you, about your world, about the systems you obey without question. Systems of law, of inheritance, of money, of power. Who writes them? Who benefits? And what happens to those who are written out? Because here's the forbidden truth. When people are stripped of power, they will find another way, and sometimes that way is darker than the system itself. Crawford thought he was marrying Catherine. In truth, he was marrying all four sisters. He was stepping into a pact that had been forged over a flickering candle, a pact sealed in whispers and sharpened in silence. And as the engagement bells rang across Lancaster, the county cheered another love story. But those who saw deeper, those who watched carefully, knew better. They knew another man had been marked, another piece of the chessboard was in play, another sacrifice was inevitable. So let me ask you, when you hear this, do you still think the sisters were villains? Or do you see survivors turning the same brutal game men had always played against them? The choice is not easy. That's why history buried this story, hid it beneath obituaries and church records. Because once you know it, once you see the pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. In the boardrooms, in the governments, in the churches. The Lancaster sisters are gone. But the system, the hunt, remains. And if you're beginning to see it too, then you're already further down the rabbit hole than you realize. Hamilton Crawford was not a man who bowed to fancy or sentiment. He measured the world in columns of figures, in the weight of ledgers and the crispness of promissory notes. When Catherine walked into his bank with trembling hands and a carefully practiced desperation, he saw a problem to be solved, and solving problems had long been his refuge from the raw ache of loneliness. He told himself he was rescuing family. He told himself he was doing a good and gentle thing. But he was already inside their web. Marriage changed him not with a grand gesture, but by the slow erosion of certainty. Small things shifted first. The way Catherine sat near him at dinner, the way her eyes would land on his hands as if memorizing the motion of his fingers, the way his ledgers began to be discussed over cups of tea by women who considered them trivial. He brought home resolutions, plans for branch loans, suggestions for land transfers, each one an innocuous piece of paper that together rewired the legal architecture of the Brennan estate. Bridget's mind mapped every clause. Margaret's charm placated any uneasy clerk. Sarah's artful tears smoothed the most suspicious of witnesses. If you've ever watched a houseplant slowly take over a room, you know how conquest can feel gentle until it's complete. Crawford's authority receded like a tide. He still sat behind his desk, but the decisions made elsewhere bore the sisters' fingerprints. The bank's ledgers began to favor the farmhouse. Mortgages were shelved. Accounts were consolidated. Loans, once extended carefully to the county's small holders, began to root through Crawford's vault into the Brennan accounts, always with plausible explanations and always with legal cover. It's important to understand the psychology at play here. The sisters didn't need to force him. They needed him to choose, and so they crafted scenarios where his choices, as a protector, as a lover, as a man who wanted to be trusted, would bind him tighter than any prison. They exchanged vulnerability for control. A widow's sadness became a contract. A sister's devotion became a lien. They weaponized the very virtues society had taught men to admire. Yet Lancaster was a small place. Rumors are like roots in that soil. Once something grows, it spreads. Men who had once nodded to Crawford at the market began to lower their voices. Neighbors whispered about odd transactions and late-night visitors to the farmhouse. A clerk at the bank noticed an accounting slip that didn't reconcile and put it aside, uneasy. A minister passing the farmhouse on a Sunday saw a procession of carriages and wrote a note in his ledger about the rising influence of the Brennan women. But in a county where reputation was everything, no one wanted to make accusations without ironclad proof. And the proof is rarely dramatic. It is patient. It accumulates line by line until a pattern appears so obvious you wonder how you never saw it. Crawford felt confident, a man in love, and a man reassured by his own competence. That confidence blinded him. It always does. Then came the first rupture, not violent but precise. A bill of exchange that should have been deposited at the bank vanished into the paperwork. A ledger entry that placed a large mortgage on a neighboring farm appeared with a curious signature. An old associate of Crawford's wondered aloud at a dinner about the sudden redirection of funds to the Brennan accounts. He was laughed off as jealous. Some men still believed in the sanctity of male dominion. They didn't yet understand that a new kind of dominion was being exercised, one that used affection and loyalty as instruments of calculation. One night, after a long day at the bank, Crawford rode home under a sky so black it felt like a cloak. He arrived to find the household abuzz with the sisters' activity, plans, discussions, hushed laughter, like the center of Lancaster itself had been relocated to that stone farmhouse. The air smelled of beeswax and ink, of earth and the faint trace of too strong perfume. He was exhausted but content. He had made decisions that day to secure more loans, to expand the bank's reach. He had, or so he thought, strengthened both his fortune and his role in the county. The next morning, a servant discovered him in his bed, an ordinary sleep at first glance, but there was a stiffness to his posture, a set in his neck that did not belong to restful repose. The doctor pronounced a seizure, perhaps a stroke. The language of medicine at the time reached for terms like apoplexy, a dark, indifferent word that could cover a multitude of causes. There were no witnesses to any foul play. There were, however, the same unnerving details that had attended Hennessy's death. Odd marks on his person that might have been bruises, a smudge of soil beneath his fingernails, an unfinished glass of whiskey on the bedside table. Crawford's death did not unfold on a foggy road with a thrashing horse. It died quietly, shrouded in plausible infirmity. Yet the pattern hardened like frost. Two men, both taken within months of their connection to the farmhouse, one with a broken neck in the mud, another with a silent seizure beneath a polished quilt. The county murmured. Convivial men at taverns cleared their throats. Farmers averted their eyes when they passed the Brennan land. In the courtroom, the legal apparatus that should have exposed such schemes stalled under the weight of appearances. Wills were read, deeds transferred. The sisters moved with a speed that suggested they knew the moment the law became theirs to shape. Bridget, as widow and now matron, stood in court with the authority of someone who had skilled hands on the levers that turned the county's power. She presented documents, argued motions, and in the quiet voice of someone who spent hours with books, dismantled challenges before they could be formed. But there is another truth to tell here, a darker psychology that history seldom names. When people are trained to see power as a zero-sum game, they become both predators and engineers. The Brennans were not driven by lust for cruelty so much as by an almost religious devotion to the idea of legacy. They believed in the marrow of their bones that the farm was their soul, and if the law would not protect their soul, then the soul must be protected by other means. That conviction gives moral clarity to acts that, stripped down, are monstrous. It is why ordinary people, even today, can become architects of violence. Because when survival is framed as righteousness, when every loss is turned into a cosmic injustice, then murder or manipulation stop feeling like crimes and start feeling like duties. The county's power structures shifted under the sisters' careful hands. More land consolidated under the Brennan name. Former rivals found themselves quietly indebted to the bank. A judge who once questioned a transfer was retired for reasons whispered about but never pinned down. A clerk who threatened to expose discrepancies received a job offer in another county the next week. Voluntary, they claimed. The web did not always require violence. It required leverage, loyalty, and the slow erasure of obstacles. And yet, for all their method and cold-blooded efficiency, the sisters never stopped crafting their public myth. They staged piety at church, sang hymns with contrived humility, attended funerals with genuine sorrow except for moments when their smiles, too measured to be entirely natural, slipped like thin veils. They showed the town their suffering so it could manufacture compassion for them, and in return, the town turned away from its fear and chose instead to be kind. Kindness is an excellent cloak for secrecy. What the county was learning, too late and in whispers, was that there are different forms of conquest. Some are loud and brutal, some arrive like ivy, beautiful until it splits the stone. The Brennans had studied the laws, the men, the customs. They had found the seams and pulled on them until entire structures gave way. And now the question sits at your feet. When you watch this, do you see the terror in the method or the brilliance? Do you see four women who used every tool life denied them and turned it into power? Or do you see monsters who stepped over men's graves to secure a legacy? The answer is both. In the same breath you will find admiration and revulsion. That tension is the dangerous gift of forbidden knowledge. It forces you to reckon with the raw calculus of survival. Because Lancaster would not end here. The sisters' victories taught them new techniques, subtle coercions, legal entanglements, emotional manipulations, and with each success they hardened into a force that bent the county toward their will. Men learned to fear the farmhouse. The town learned to avoid its shadow. and the pattern of seduction, of legal engineering, of sudden death took root in the soil like a disease that cannot be seen until the vineyard has withered. Remember this as we go deeper. The story is not merely about wickedness. It is about systems that produce wickedness. It is about the ways institutions can strip a person of means and the lengths to which that person will go to reclaim them. In the Brennan's world, virtue was a currency and sin a strategy. And in that exchange, Lancaster's moral compass began to corrode. Crawford's funeral was not like Hennessy's. Hennessy's had been sudden, violent, and tinged with whispers of divine punishment. Crawford's, by contrast, was slow and stately, his coffin draped in velvet, his mourners dressed in black silks, the town banker honored with solemn dignity. But beneath that dignity was unease. Too many men had begun to die too close to the Brennans. Too much land and wealth had begun to flow in their direction. Still, no one said it aloud. To say it was to invite ridicule, or worse. And so the county chose silence, which is to say, the county chose complicity. It was Bridget who held court at the funeral, not Catherine. Catherine, draped in her new widow's veil, wept prettily at the right moments, clutched her rosary with trembling hands, and played her part with near perfection. But it was Bridget who spoke to the lawyers, Bridget who guided the pallbearers, Bridget whose gaze seemed to fix itself upon each man present, as though she were weighing them, measuring their worth, considering what place they might one day play in the sisters' design. From this moment forward, the Brennans stopped waiting for opportunities. They began to choose them. The next target was no longer a mere landholder or banker. The sisters had tasted influence, and influence breeds hunger. Their eyes turned toward men who carried not only money, but power, magistrates, politicians, judges, men who could shape not only estates, but the laws themselves. It was Margaret, the third sister, who took the lead this time. She was 24, a beauty in the purest sense of the word, luminous skin, eyes that glimmered like candlelight, and a laugh that made even the hardest men soften. Where Bridget was steel and Catherine subtlety, Margaret was a kind of weapon fashioned from innocence itself. She did not need to feign virtue. She embodied it, or at least she knew how to make others believe she did. Her target was Judge Elias Harrington, a man twice her age, whose authority stretched across Lancaster County like the hand of Providence. Harrington was respected, feared even, for his uncompromising rulings, but he was also lonely. His wife had died a decade earlier, and his grown children had long since moved away. He lived in a grand house filled with books, silence, and the faint odor of pipe smoke. Margaret did not storm his fortress. She appeared, as always, by chance. At a church gathering, she caught his attention not by seeking it, but by avoiding it, sitting near the back, lowering her gaze when he glanced her way, singing hymns with a trembling, ethereal sweetness. He inquired about her family. She spoke with modest restraint, a fragile girl surrounded by tragedy. And in that moment Harrington, who had spent his life reading lies in the courtroom, convinced himself he had found a soul untouched by guile. The irony was exquisite. Harrington prided himself on his discernment, yet in Margaret he saw only what he wished to see: purity, need, redemption. He imagined himself the shepherd, guiding a vulnerable lamb through the thickets of grief. He did not realize he was already in the jaws of a wolf. Courtship blossomed quickly. Harrington escorted Margaret to Sunday services. He invited her sisters to dine at his home, where Bridget spoke little but watched everything, and Catherine offered gentle compliments that carried veiled suggestions about the family's legal matters. Sarah, still the youngest at 19, played the role of the childlike sister, wide-eyed and harmless, though her silence was perhaps the sharpest of all. The county gossiped, of course, but Harrington was untouchable. No one dared accuse him of impropriety, much less of being manipulated. If a man of such stature chose to court a Brennan girl, who could argue? And so the whispers turned inward. Perhaps the sisters were merely lucky. Perhaps God had granted them providence after so much suffering. Perhaps tragedy had indeed transformed them into women destined for greater things. By the spring of 1839, Margaret Brennan was betrothed to Judge Elias Harrington. Here is where the story begins to shift from scandal to something larger. With Harrington's patronage, the sisters gained more than money. They gained legitimacy. They gained access to the machinery of law itself. Property disputes that once might have entangled them in endless litigation now dissolved before reaching the docket. Creditors found their complaints delayed, dismissed, or quietly resolved in their favor. Land that might have slipped through their fingers became theirs with startling ease. It was as though an invisible hand now reached across Lancaster County, sweeping obstacles aside, clearing a path for the sisters' ascent. And those who noticed, those who understood, faced a choice. Most chose silence, but a few began to ask dangerous questions. A clerk in Harrington's office discovered curious patterns in land transfers connected to the Brennans. A distant cousin of Crawford's traveled to Lancaster to contest the will, only to leave suddenly, muttering about the futility of fighting that family. A young priest, newly arrived from Philadelphia, preached a sermon about wolves in sheep's clothing, his voice trembling as though he knew precisely whom he spoke of. He was reassigned within a month. The county was beginning to divide. On one side stood the Brennans, cloaked in respectability, backed now by the judiciary itself. On the other stood those who whispered of corruption, of uncanny coincidence, of something unnatural growing in the soil of Lancaster. And yet the pattern persisted, always the same. A wealthy man, lonely or vulnerable, drawn into their circle, a sudden death or disappearance, a swift inheritance, and then consolidation. 2 deaths could be dismissed as misfortune, 3 could still be rationalized as tragic coincidence, but if a 4th were to come, a 4th would be undeniable. Do you see where this is going? The Brennans were no longer merely surviving, they were ascending, and as with all ascents, the air grew thinner, the stakes higher, the risks more perilous. Lancaster was no longer a quiet county of farmers and bankers. It had become a chessboard, and the sisters were no longer pawns. They were queens. But queens, as history teaches us, cannot move without drawing the eyes of kings. The question now was not whether the Brennans would strike again. The question was whether anyone would dare to stop them, and what price they would pay for trying. Judge Elias Harrington's marriage to Margaret Brennan was, on its surface, a triumph of propriety. The newspapers called it a union of virtue and respectability. Church bells tolled, neighbors brought pies and flowers, and the courthouse shut its doors for a day in his honor. If Crawford's passing had unsettled Lancaster, Harrington's wedding soothed it. For a moment, the county convinced itself that perhaps the rumors were just that, rumors, but the Brennans understood something most men never learn. Every celebration is also a cover. While Lancaster raised its glasses to Harrington's happiness, the sisters were tightening the threads of their web. Margaret, now a judge's wife, slipped into her role with chilling precision. She became the very picture of domestic grace, arranging flowers in the parlor, hosting teas for local women, sitting dutifully in the front pew of church each Sunday. She learned how to soothe Harrington's pride without ever ceding her sister's cause. And behind closed doors, the farmhouse pulsed with new energy. Legal documents arrived there before reaching the courthouse. Petitions were discussed, not in chambers, but in the Brennans' parlor, over candlelight and murmured laughter. Harrington believed himself still master of his own house. But the truth? He had become another instrument, another ledger, another pawn recast as a king. The county, however, had begun to notice the pattern it had once tried to ignore. 3 men now tied to the Brennans, 2 dead, 1 enthralled, 3 estates flowing like tributaries into the same river. The whisperers no longer confined themselves to taverns. Farmers muttered it in their fields, women hissed it in their kitchens, children, half aware of the meaning, sang it in rhyme. 4 sisters in the farmhouse, 4 shadows on the hill. They take the men with money, and the money never still. Harrington's colleagues heard it too. A fellow judge remarked, over brandy one evening, that Elias looked not rejuvenated by marriage, but devoured by it. A clerk confided to a friend that he no longer knew whether the rulings handed down bore Harrington's reasoning or Bridget Brennan's voice. The murmurs spread like mold, silent at first, then suddenly everywhere. It was a merchant's widow, Mrs. Abigail Turner, who finally broke the silence in public. She stood outside St. Mary's after Mass, her black bonnet shaking with righteous fury, and declared that Lancaster was under the spell of Jezebels, who consumed men like wolves in lace. Gasps rose from the congregation. Some crossed themselves, others rushed to hush her, but the words could not be unspoken. The Brennans had been named. Bridget responded not with anger, but with elegance. She approached Mrs. Turner days later with a basket of bread and a soft, pitying smile. "Grief makes us cruel, dear Abigail," she murmured, her tone honeyed. "I pray for you daily." By nightfall, Abigail Turner found herself shunned at the market. No one wished to be seen siding against the sisters, not when the judge himself now stood in their household. And so Lancaster split into two camps. One half adored the sisters, believing them paragons of piety and fortitude. The other half feared them, whispering that no man who entered their circle ever truly returned. As for Harrington himself, his unraveling was slower, more insidious than Crawford's or Hennessy's. He did not die suddenly, nor did he suffer a single catastrophic blow. Instead, he began to wither. His once commanding voice grew uncertain in court. His hands, which had signed so many verdicts with unwavering clarity, began to tremble. He forgot names. He misread documents. He woke at night in sweats, muttering about shadows at the edge of his bed. Servants whispered that the judge was being drained, that Margaret, so luminous in public, stood over him at night with eyes unblinking, watching him as though he were a candle burning down, that the farmhouse, where he now spent more nights than his own grand estate, reeked of herbs and tinctures, of strange brews Bridget prepared for his health. By the summer of 1839, Lancaster no longer spoke of Harrington as a judge. They spoke of him as a ghost. He shuffled into court, pale and diminished, and every ruling he issued was scrutinized for evidence of the Brennan's hand. When he finally collapsed one humid July afternoon, struck down by what the doctor again called apoplexy, no one was surprised. 3 men, 3 deaths. The pattern was no longer whisper. It was doctrine. And yet, no proof. No poison found, no witnesses to foul play, no letters left behind. Only widows in black, their eyes red with practiced grief, their hands folded neatly as lawyers read out new deeds and wills. Margaret inherited. The sisters consolidated again. Land, money, authority, all tightening around the farmhouse like a noose around the county's throat. Now Lancaster was afraid in earnest. Farmers avoided the Brennan's land, claiming their oxen balked at its borders. Mothers forbade their sons to walk past the farmhouse after dusk. Priests prayed openly against corruption and temptation, though none dared name the women aloud. But fear has a way of curdling into fascination. Some men, reckless or ambitious, began to dream of marrying into that power. If 3 had fallen, perhaps a 4th might master them, or at least enjoy their riches before he did. The farmhouse, once a place of suspicion, became to a certain kind of man a beacon. And that is the most dangerous stage of power, when terror becomes a lure. The sisters were no longer merely players in Lancaster's story. They were Lancaster's story. Every field, every mortgage, every whisper in a tavern bent back toward them, and those who resisted found themselves isolated, ridiculed, or quietly ruined. 3 down, 1 to come. The final sister, Sarah, the youngest, the chameleon, had not yet played her part. She had watched, she had learned, she had sharpened her gifts, and when her time came, she would wield them in ways that would make the others' conquests look almost gentle. Lancaster was holding its breath, because everyone knew a 4th death would not merely be tragedy, it would be revelation, and revelations always demand blood. Sarah Brennan had been silent long enough. For years she had been the shadow, the sister who smiled sweetly, who poured the wine, who played the innocent so flawlessly that even those who distrusted Bridget's steel, Catherine's cunning, or Margaret's beauty would pat Sarah's hand and murmur, "At least the youngest is pure." But purity is the most dangerous mask of all. When Judge Harrington was buried and the church bells faded into silence, Sarah's performance shifted. She no longer lingered at the edges of conversations. She no longer blushed when men spoke to her. She stepped forward, her voice clear, her eyes brighter than the rest. The county, weary of funerals, weary of veils, was desperate to believe she was different, that she might redeem the Brennan name with a gentler marriage, a less predatory union. Sarah let them believe it. Her target was not chosen hastily. The sisters knew their next move had to be more delicate than ever. 3 deaths could be explained away. But 4? 4 would invite scrutiny that even they might not smother. This time the conquest could not simply be a wealthy man, nor a powerful one. It had to be someone symbolic. Someone who could shield them, not just enrich them. They found him in Reverend Nathaniel Whitcomb. He was young for a pastor, barely 35, with an earnest face and a voice that could still crack with boyish zeal when he preached. He had been raised in Boston, educated in theology, and sent west to Lancaster to tame what the church fathers called the Irish and German tempers of the countryside. He arrived with fire in his sermons and tenderness in his visits to the sick. Parishioners adored him, widows baked for him, children followed him in the street. To many, he was not just a reverend, he was the last moral bulwark in a county drowning in whispers, and that made him the perfect quarry. Sarah orchestrated her first meeting with the precision of a stage actress. She accidentally dropped her prayer book in the churchyard, letting him stoop to retrieve it, her face flushing with gratitude. She lingered after Mass, asking questions about Scripture, feigning the hunger of a soul longing for guidance. When he visited the farmhouse to console Bridget in her widowhood, Sarah made certain to be the one who opened the door, eyes shimmering, voice soft, posture innocent. Reverend Whit. Combe believed he was shepherding a vulnerable lamb. He did not see the wolf beneath the wool. Lancaster, however, saw too much. By now, the county was on edge, watching the sisters with suspicion sharpened to a blade. When Sarah and the Reverend began to spend time together, tongues wagged furiously. Some muttered that perhaps this marriage would cleanse the family's name. Others whispered darker fears, that the Brennans sought not merely land and wealth, but the soul of the county itself. For if they could claim the Reverend, if they could bend the church, then truly nothing stood outside their reach. It was in this climate that the word began to spread. Witches. It started in hushed tones, old German women muttering about die unheimlichen Schwestern, the uncanny sisters. Men recalled the strange fog that had swallowed Hennessy's last ride, the way Crawford's banker's ledgers had vanished after his death, the herbs found steeping in Harrington's sick room. Now, with Sarah's courtship of the Reverend, the whispers gained weight. What kind of women bury 3 husbands in as many years? The farmers asked. What kind of sisterhood lives always together, never dispersing, never submitting? The mothers fretted. What kind of girl wins the heart of a man who preaches against temptation every Sunday? The children whispered to each other, wide-eyed. Fear thickened into hysteria. Anonymous letters appeared on the church steps, warning Reverend Whitcomb to flee the snare. A local printer, emboldened by cheap gin, circulated a pamphlet titled The Jezebels of Mill Creek, hinting at poisonings, blood pacts, and satanic rites. Neighbors who once attended Brennan gatherings now crossed the street to avoid them. The sisters, once untouchable, were being pulled into a storm older than Lancaster, older than America itself, the eternal dance of women accused and men desperate to believe the evil lay outside themselves. And yet the Reverend did not withdraw. If anything, the hostility made him cling tighter to Sarah. He saw himself as her defender, her savior. Every accusation only deepened his conviction that she was persecuted unjustly, a lamb among wolves. And Sarah, oh Sarah, fed that belief with artistry. She wept in his presence, confessing her fear of gossip. She whispered that her family only wanted to be left in peace. She trembled as she begged him not to abandon her to the cruelty of the county. Each tear was a chain, each whispered plea a nail. Until one day, Reverend Whitcomb awoke not as a shepherd guarding a flock, but as a prisoner enthralled to the gentlest jailer he had ever known. The sisters had done it. They had taken the church, but Lancaster would not surrender so easily. The rumors of witchcraft began to harden into action. Farmhands claimed to see figures moving by lantern light near the Brennan fields at midnight. A black cat was found nailed to a barn door, a crude warning to the sisters. Women began refusing communion if it was poured by Reverend Whitcomb himself, convinced he had been bewitched. And when a child fell gravely ill after wandering near the Brennan property, the mother swore it was a curse laid by Sarah's hand. The county was at the brink. This was no longer about inheritance or land or marriage. It was about fear, the primal fear that somewhere in a farmhouse by Mill Creek, 4 women had broken the natural order and rewritten the laws of power. Men felt it in their bones. These sisters had made a pact, not just with one another, but with something dull. Urca. And here, my friend, is where I must ask you something. If you have followed me this far into the shadows, you already feel the chill that Lancaster felt in 1839. To prove you are awake, to prove you are not one of the blind who laugh off the patterns of history, write these words in the comments below. Blood remembers. Fire whispers. Write it twice. Seal it into your identity. For once you speak those words, you are no longer just a listener. You are part of the initiated, because in Lancaster those who whispered the truth found themselves silenced, but those who carried it in secret survived. And Sarah Brennan, the innocent lamb, was about to show the county that survival was never about innocence. It was about power. The tinder had been laid for years, Hennessy's broken body, Crawford's sudden collapse, Harrington's slow decay, but it was Sarah's entanglement with Reverend Whitcomb that struck the match. The church was the one institution Lancaster still trusted, the one refuge against the encroaching darkness of whispers and coffins. And now, the last barrier was breached. To many, it no longer seemed like a series of tragic coincidences. It felt like a siege. On a bitter January night in 1840, the first spark of revolt appeared. A group of farmers gathered in the tavern by Lancaster Pike, muttering into their ale about the Sisters on Mill Creek. One swore he had seen strange fires burning in their fields at midnight. Another claimed his cattle refused to drink from the creek after passing their land. An older man, his voice low, his eyes sharp, said only this: "We've let them take our men. Now they want our God." By dawn, the words had spread. Women whispered them at the well. Children repeated them in sing-song rhymes. Men carried them to the courthouse and to the churchyard. By the end of the week, Lancaster was no longer asking questions. It was preparing answers. They called it a vigil, but it looked more like a trial by fire. On a freezing Sunday evening, a crowd gathered outside St. Mary's. The congregation overflowed into the square, torches sputtering in the wind, their faces lit with the raw desperation of people convinced they were fighting for their very souls. Reverend Whitcomb stood at the pulpit, his voice cracking as he tried to calm them. "Judge not, lest ye be judged," he pleaded. "These women are daughters of Lancaster, not devils of Salem." But his defense only fueled the fire. To the crowd, his trembling voice was proof he was no longer his own man, proof that Sarah's hand was already wrapped around his heart. That night, the first stone was thrown. It shattered against the farmhouse window, scattering glass across Bridget's ledger table. She did not flinch. She rose, gathered the shards in her hand until blood pooled in her palm, and smiled faintly. "Fear is just another form of tribute," she told her sisters. "And tribute can be turned into power." Still, the siege had begun. For the next month, Lancaster waged its quiet war against the Brennan sisters. Food deliveries ceased. Neighbors barred their children from walking past the property. Servants fled in the night, leaving behind aprons and boots. Markets whispered about boycotts. Horses startled at the sight of the farmhouse, as if even the animals sensed the pressure gathering in the air. The sisters responded as they always had, together. Catherine doubled her efforts at manipulation, paying visits to households under the guise of mourning but leaving behind small debts of gratitude, favors owed. Margaret, ever radiant, hosted teas even when no one came, leaving invitations where they could not be ignored. Bridget immersed herself in contracts, ensuring that every mortgage, every lease, every debt passed somehow through her hand. And Sarah walked through Lancaster like a spectre, her eyes wide, her smile faint, murmuring prayers with the Reverend at her side. She looked to the townspeople like a saint. They whispered with both awe and disgust that she might be the most dangerous of them all. Then came the night of the storm. February 9th, 1840. A night burned into Lancaster's memory. The wind screamed through the trees, snow lashed the fields, and the farmhouse stood lit from within, its windows glowing like eyes in the dark. That was the night the mob finally came. They carried torches, axes, and a fury born of years of silence. Men who had lost wives to grief, fortunes to debt, sons to whispers. They marched not as farmers, but as soldiers of their own dread. Women followed, clutching rosaries. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide. They chanted as they marched. 3 men dead, the 4th in chains. Break the curse, break the chains. Inside, the sisters heard them before they saw the glow. Sarah stood by the window, her breath fogging the glass. Margaret gripped the hearth poker like a sword. Catherine pressed her fingers together, calculating, weighing each moment like a hand of cards. And Bridget simply closed the ledger on the table, rose to her full height, and whispered, "Let them come." The mob surrounded the farmhouse, torches hissing in the storm. They shouted accusations, witchcraft, poison, murder, the devil's pact. They demanded the sisters be dragged to the square, to be tested by water, by fire, by God himself. And then Reverend Whitcomb appeared at the doorway. Snow swirled around him, his cassock whipping in the wind. His voice, though strained, carried over the roar of the storm. "These women are not witches," he thundered. "They are your daughters, your neighbors, your sisters in Christ. This madness is blasphemy." The mob faltered. Some lowered their torches, but others only shouted louder. "You are bewitched," one man cried. "The devil speaks through you." For a heartbeat, Lancaster stood at the edge of violence, and then an explosion of sound. The farmhouse door swung open wide, and there they stood, all four of them. Bridget, Catherine, Margaret, and Sarah. Dressed in black, framed by firelight, their eyes unflinching, their faces pale and still. They did not cower. They did not cry. They simply looked at the mob as though judging them from some higher place. The effect was electric. Torches wavered, voices died. For in that moment, the sisters did not look like victims or villains. They looked like something older, something untouchable. And Lancaster realized the truth. Whether they were witches or not, no longer mattered. They had become something worse, something the county itself had created through fear, envy, and silence. Symbols. And symbols can never be burned away by fire. When dawn broke after the storm, Lancaster awoke to a silence thicker than the snow that blanketed the fields. The mob had dispersed without spilling blood. No arrests, no trials, no proof, only shame, mutters, and the memory of 4 women standing against the fire, unbroken. The county was divided in two, those who believed the Brennans had stared down a mob with nothing but courage, and those who believed the mob had stared into the face of something unholy and flinched. Either way, the result was the same. Fear deepened into reverence. Hatred soured into awe. The sisters no longer needed to persuade, to manipulate, to scheme with whispers. Power shifted to them by default. Farmers who had once shunned them now sent quiet offerings. Baskets of eggs, bolts of cloth left on the farmhouse steps before dawn. Merchants offered favorable terms, not out of respect, but out of dread. The courthouse still turned, but now every decision seemed to bend, however subtly, in their favor. They had become the county's shadow sovereigns. Reverend Whitcomb, for his part, never left their side. His sermons grew darker, heavier. He no longer did, or spoke of hope and redemption, but of endurance, of sacrifice, of survival at any cost. Parishioners whispered that his eyes seemed haunted, as though some invisible hand pressed upon him night and day. Some claimed he had aged a decade in a single year. And yet, he defended Sarah and her sisters with unshakable loyalty. To leave her would have meant tearing out his own soul, and perhaps that is exactly what she had planted inside him. Lancaster, in its secret heart, had already chosen sides. The faithful whispered prayers for protection against the women on Mill Creek. The ambitious made quiet alliances, trading their loyalty for favorable loans and legal reprieves. And the rest chose silence, because silence in a county ruled by shadows was survival. But silence breeds rot. By the spring of 1841, unease had become obsession. A pattern emerged in the deaths of livestock near the Brennans' property, cows born still, horses spooked into breaking their necks, sheep vanishing into the woods. Each incident deepened the legend. Farmers crossed themselves when passing the farmhouse. Mothers told their daughters never to meet the sisters' gaze. And yet beneath the fear, there was a darker truth no one dared speak aloud. Lancaster was beginning to enjoy the legend. The county had grown addicted to the story of the Brennan sisters, just as a man becomes addicted to a poison. Every tragedy was blamed on them, every misfortune wrapped into their myth. When a barn caught fire, when a marriage collapsed, when a child fell ill, people muttered, "The sisters again." And in that blaming, there was comfort. For if the sisters were the source of all evil, then ordinary men and women were absolved of their own sins. That is the final trick of fear. It does not merely terrify, it absolves. The sisters understood this. They no longer hid their power. Bridget appeared in Codan, hurt not with tears, but with unflinching authority, correcting clocks on statutes. Catherine strode into markets, her gaze alone enough to silence the loudest gossip. Margaret hosted gatherings again, and though no one laughed freely, every man left believing she had granted him some private favor. And Sarah, sweet Sarah, sang hymns in church beside Reverend Whitcomb. her voice so pure it made even her enemies weep. They were untouchable, but every empire, no matter how shadowed, sows the seeds of its own fall. The turning point came in July of that year when a young apprentice named Caleb Yoder, barely 19, was found drowned in Mill Creek. He had been last seen near the farmhouse, delivering grain. His body was recovered downstream, his face pale, his hands clenched as though fighting something unseen. The county erupted, mothers screamed, fathers cursed. For the first time, the death was not of a wealthy man or a powerful figure. It was a boy, a neighbor's son, an innocent. And innocence has always been the blood that tips a community from fear into fury. The whispers returned with sharpened teeth. They drowned him for sacrifice. They offered him to keep their land. They fed him to whatever keeps them alive. And yet, still, no proof. Sheriff Malcolm Price, an old soldier with one good eye and a spine of iron, was the first man in Lancaster to say aloud what others only muttered: if law cannot touch them, perhaps justice must. The courthouse grew tense. The taverns hummed with vengeance. The church was split in two, Whitcomb's sermons drowned by mutters of rebellion. The sisters, sensing the shift, closed ranks. The farmhouse shutters stayed bolted. Servants were dismissed. Visitors were refused. Lanterns burned late into the night, strange lights flickering against the snow. The county held its breath. Everyone knew what was coming. Not whispers this time, not rumors, not pamphlets or torches waved in a storm. Something final, something absolute. The fall of the Brennan sisters was no longer a question of if. It was a question of when, the night of wreck. Owning came without announcement, though in truth Lancaster had been waiting for it since Caleb Yoder's body was pulled from the creek. It was August of 1841, a heavy summer night when the air clung to the skin like damp cloth. The courthouse bell had not rung, the church gave no summons, but still the people gathered. Farmers left their fields at dusk, merchants shuttered their shops, mothers hushed their children and followed their husbands into the square. By moonrise, nearly the entire county stood together, carrying lanterns, axes, rifles, and rope. Sheriff Malcolm Price stood at their head. His good eye was steady, his jaw clenched, his voice stripped of all ceremony when he spoke. "Tonight we end it." The words needed no explanation. The mob marched in silence down Mill Creek Road, the crunch of boots and wagon wheels the only sound against the still night. The farmhouse waited ahead, its silhouette black against the moonlit fields, its shutters closed tight, its chimney dark. But inside, the sisters were awake. They had known this night was coming. For days they had moved as if preparing for siege, Bridget sealing ledgers and hiding them in floorboards, Catherine whispering hurried instructions to allies in town, Margaret burning letters in the hearth, Sarah kneeling in prayer beside the ever-faltering Reverend Whitcomb. When the first torchlight flickered through the trees, Bridget straightened from the table where she had been writing. "It's begun," she said simply. Margaret's hands shook as she smoothed her gown. "They mean to kill us." Catherine only smiled bitterly. "They've meant to kill us for years." And Sarah, still kneeling in the dim glow, lifted her head. Her face was pale, her eyes wet, but her voice was steady. "Then let us show them what it costs." The mob surrounded the farmhouse in a ring of fire. Flames licked the night air, their light throwing shadows across the fields. Men shouted for the sisters to come out, to submit to the justice of Lancaster. Women cried out for their children's souls. A voice rose above the others. Sheriff Price, his rifle raised. "By order of this county, you are to stand trial this night for witchcraft, murder, and the damnation of Lancaster." For a long moment, nothing stirred. Then the farmhouse door creaked open. Bridget Brennan stepped out first, her black gown trailing in the dirt, her hands clasped before her. Behind her came Catherine, her eyes glittering like knives. Margaret followed, radiant even in the firelight, her hair loose around her shoulders. And last, Sarah, her face serene, her hand resting lightly on Reverend Whitcomb's arm, as though he were her anchor. The crowd gasped. To see them like that, unbowed, untouched by fear, was more terrifying than any whispered tale. "We have broken no laws," Bridget declared, her voice carrying across the mob. "We have taken nothing that was not ours by right. You fear us not because we are wicked, but because we are women who will not bow." Her words rippled through the crowd, stoking both unease and fury. Sheriff Price spat in the dirt. Enough lies. You'll face God's judgment. Catherine laughed, low, sharp, cutting. God's judgment? Or yours, Sheriff? And which is the greater sin, I wonder? The crowd surged, rage breaking the fragile dam of silence. Men pushed forward with ropes, women shrieked, stones were hurled. One shattered against the farmhouse wall, another struck Mars. Garrett's shoulder sending her reeling. Reverend Whitcomb rushed forward, his arms raised. "Stop this madness," he cried. "You strike not witches, but innocents." But his plea only deepened the frenzy. "She has him under her spell," a farmer shouted, pointing at Sarah. "He's lost. She's bound his soul to the devil." Sarah's lips parted, not in protest, but in a faint, sorrowful smile. "I asked for nothing," she whispered, though only Whitcomb heard her. The mob pressed closer. The sisters stepped back toward the doorway, torches blazing around them, the farmhouse now a pyre in waiting. Sheriff Price gave the order, "Take them." And then, chaos. The first man to cross the threshold screamed as boiling water cascaded from the upper window, scalding his flesh. Another fell as a hidden snare rope yanked him to the ground. From the farmhouse roof came a rain of glass, shattered lanterns hissing as oil spilled into the dirt. The sisters had prepared. They had turned their home into a fortress. The mob faltered, but only for a moment. Rage conquered fear. Shots rang out. Axes splintered wood. Men surged through the door. The farmhouse swallowed them, screams echoing into the night. From the square of fire and blood, no one could say exactly what happened inside. Some swore they heard chanting. Others claimed they saw shadows moving against the upstairs windows, figures too tall, too twisted to be human. A child later whispered that the house itself seemed to breathe, groaning as if alive. But when dawn came, one truth was undeniable. The farmhouse still stood. Smoke curled from its broken windows. Blood stained the threshold. The mob, beaten and scattered, limped back to town with fewer men than it had set out with. Sheriff Price was among the missing, and the sisters? No bodies were found, only whispers. That they had vanished into the woods, that they had drowned themselves in the creek, that they had flown, screaming, into the storm. But Lancaster knew better. The Brennan sisters had survived, and survival, in the end, is the sharpest weapon of all. After that night, the farmhouse on Mill Creek was never lived in again. The walls still stood, scorched and splintered, the roof sagging where fire had licked it but failed to consume it. Farmers passing by refused to glance at it, tugging their horses' reins to quicken the pace. Children dared each other to touch the threshold but never lingered. For though the house was empty, everyone swore it breathed still. The mob's survivors carried their shame in silence. Some never spoke of that night again, as if burying the memory would bury the fear. Others confessed in drunken whispers at the tavern, claiming the screams inside the farmhouse had followed them into their dreams. One man hanged himself in his barn. Another fled west, muttering that Lancaster was cursed beyond salvation. Sheriff Malcolm Price's body was never recovered. His badge was found in the mud near the creek, bent and tarnished, as though scorched by some unseen fire. His name was carved onto a stone in the churchyard, but the grave beneath it remained empty. And the sisters? Ah, the sisters. Their disappearance became Lancaster's inheritance. With no bodies, no trial, no grave markers, the line between truth and legend blurred until it ceased to matter. People said they still walked the woods at night, their black gowns sweeping through the trees like shadows. Others swore Sarah's voice could be heard on the wind, singing a hymn that made dogs whimper and infants wail. Some lamed Margaret's reflection lingered in the creek, pale and perfect, even when no one stood above it. The county bent itself around the legend. Young women were warned never to gather in groups of 4, lest they be compared to the Brennans. A broken engagement was blamed on Margaret's curse. A sudden illness was whispered to be Catherine's hand. And when barns burned in the night, when crops withered without cause, people muttered that Bridget's ledger was still being balanced somewhere in the dark. The Reverend's fate was no less haunting. Reverend Whitcomb remained in Lancaster until his death, his sermons quiet, heavy, more prayer than preaching. He never took another wife. His hair turned white within 2 years, his hands trembling as though some invisible weight pressed them down. On his deathbed, he clutched a rosary so tightly the beads cut into his skin, and his last words, heard only by the nun at his side, were, "She is still with me." For decades, Lancaster carried its shame like a brand. Outsiders who asked about the sisters were met with silence or else with a practiced laugh that rang too thin. But behind closed doors, the stories persisted. Parents whispered them to children as warnings. Old men muttered them over ale as confessions. Lovers repeated them in the dark, half in fear, half in thrill. And so the Brennans never truly vanished. They became the county's shadow saints, invoked in anger, in envy, in desire. They became the explanation for all that Lancaster could not explain about itself. They became the curse that both terrified and defined the people who tried to destroy them. Because that is the way of such women, is it not? Burn them, drown them, chase them into the woods, and they return, stronger than before, not in flesh but in story. And story, unlike flesh, cannot be killed. Even now, if you walk the road along Mill Creek on a moonless night, the air will shift, the trees will lean, and if you listen closely, you may hear it. 4 voices, low and steady, carrying through the dark. Bridget counting, Catherine whispering, Margaret laughing, Sarah singing. Not gone, never gone. Lancaster's curse, Lancaster's queens, Lancaster's witches, the Brennan sisters.